You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96, and we just completed the Jazz Zone with Ken Providence, and he did a nice tribute to Charles Gale. And we are on the line. We're joined on the line by Dr. Gerald Horne, a regular, and Dr. Horne's forthcoming book is Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists, Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. And he will be talking about that book and other books in Leimert Park on, I think, February the 3rd. And I know a lot of people are anticipating that particular meeting. So how are you doing today, sir?
Oh, it's all good. February 3rd, 1 to 3, Africa Town, Leimert Park. Be there or be square.
Be there or be square. Well, like I say, I have many relatives who live in Leimert Park, and one in particular, Donald told me to tell you again that he'll be there with his, like Johnny Moore said, he'll be there with his red suit on. And so you won't be able to miss him. So we are, I guess, the most burning question is still what's taking place in Gaza. I was looking at a documentary a few minutes ago, which featured Rosemary Mealy. It featured Bill Sales, Sinkay Brath, and they were talking about the fact. They mentioned the fact one of a Palestinian sister, whose name I can't recall because I just saw it for the first time, mentioned the fact that Malcolm actually had gone to Gaza, and Malcolm wrote this. He wrote a paper for the Egyptian newspaper. I think Gamal Nasser's son and his mother was Kwame Nkrumah's wife. They were talking about the relationship of Africans in America to the whole Palestinian struggle. So let us talk about what is taking place in Gaza and Palestine as we speak.
Well, as we speak, a member of Prime Minister Netanyahu's cabinet has made explicit what has been implicit. That is to say, to push out the indigenous inhabitants and return to Israeli Jewish settlement, which we had thought had been curtailed, if not ended, in 2005. The problem for the Israelis is that they're losing soldiers at a regular clip because their soldiers have not been accustomed to fighting forces like the Al-Qassam brigades and their comrades, or Hezbollah, or Ansar Allah in Yemen. They've been accustomed to breaking the arms of teenagers on the West Bank. And the contradiction there is that Prime Minister Netanyahu faces the prospect of being prosecuted once this war concludes. So he has all the incentive in the world to continue. He's being assisted by his comrades in Washington. Mr. Biden and his administration have just authorized yet another cache of weapons to go across the Atlantic to the war criminals, circumventing the role of Congress, by the way. And we should take off our hats and give a salute to the South African government, which has brought a case pursuant to the Genocide Convention before the International Court of Justice against the Israeli war criminals. Now, this is important. However, you should know that, number one, it'll take a while for the investigation to proceed. And number two, it will be inevitably referred to the United Nations Security Council for action, whereby it will probably be blocked by the U.S. aiders and abettors of genocide. However, it's still an important maneuver by the South African government, and it also marks another feather in the cap of Africa, because the last time we had a referral to the International Court of Justice was when the Gambian government in West Africa brought a case against the military authorities in Myanmar over the Rohingya, that is to say, over Burma. So we should keep a close and steady eye on the role of South Africans and Africans in general with regard to vindicating international human rights, not least because there are those here in North America who may down the road, sooner rather than later, may have to call upon the brothers and sisters and governments and comrades in Africa to vindicate our international human rights. Given the fact that this is the last day of the year, let me rehearse some points that I've made with regard to this crisis since it was ignited on October 7th. A major point being why the settler colonies in North America have been so energetic in supporting the settler colony in historic Palestine. First of all, I should say that part of the upside of this crisis, if there is any, is that many who had not heretofore seen Canada and the United States as being settler colonies, as a result of the invocation of that term with regard to Israel, have begun to look anew at North America, and voila, they see North America as being a hotbed of settler colonies, which is a fair assessment, particularly Canada and the United States. And this goes back to the origins of English colonialism, not necessarily in Ireland, but I'm speaking of the fact that at the end of the 13th century, England expelled its Jewish population, but by the 1500s, after King Henry VIII had made a turn towards the Protestant sect, pursuant to the breakaway secessionist maneuver by Martin Luther from the Catholics, he was under the gun, he and his successors, and so they began to welcome the Jewish population, then in the process of being expelled from Spain and Portugal, the Catholic powers, because they had embarked upon an inquisition whereby you either had to profess Catholicism or run the risk of being liquidated or tortured. And as it turns out, that turned out to be the winning ticket in terms of the high stakes gamble that was settler colonialism. That is to say that the Jewish diaspora played a major role in helping to construct the settler colonies in North America, subsequently constructing the United States of America, receiving assurances from George Washington himself with regard to that rather influential Jewish population in Newport, Rhode Island. Newport, Rhode Island, as you know, was an essential cog in the African slave trading machine. And despite bumps in the road, I'm speaking of, for example, the lynching of the Jewish man Leo Frank, perhaps 100 years ago in Georgia, whereby he sought to point the finger of accusation at a black janitor at the plant that he managed in Georgia outside of Atlanta. Interestingly enough, the lynchers, the Christian lynchers, Christian lynchers, Euro-American, they believed, interestingly enough, the black janitor over Leo Frank, the Jewish man, which is something to ponder. However, that did lead to many Jewish elites helping to support the NAACP and anti-lynching maneuvers. And it also sheds light on why in 1947, 1948, you saw the United States standing almost first, if not second in line, in recognizing the new state of Israel, and has been in bed with the new state of Israel ever since. Now, let's turn to the present. The Israeli authorities say that they're under siege on 7 fronts, that they're waging war on 7 fronts today, December 31st, 2023. In Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, which may be ultimately the most influential front, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Yemen, which may be number 2 in terms of influential fronts. Certainly, that's a sad commentary on Israeli diplomacy, because states oftentimes do not want to fight a 2-front war. Recall the statement from U.S. President Abraham Lincoln when he was fighting the slave owners in 1861, 1862. He had reason to believe they were being supported by London, and there were those in his regime that wanted him to then declare war against London. But he said, one war at a time, please. And that has been the general outlook. And now you see Israel facing, they say, 7 wars. And predictably, this has led to a cratering of the Israeli economy. Southern Israel has been largely abandoned. Ditto for northern Israel, facing missile strikes from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. It's not clear, at least to objective observers, if Israel as an apartheid state can survive this onslaught that it is presently facing. Also, predictably, it's had ramifications on this side of the Atlantic. The Zionist Lobby has been in the forefront of shredding civil liberties. You are not allowed on certain campuses to chant the slogan "from the river to the sea," or even use the term intifada, because supposedly that mandates genocide against Jewish people. I kid you not. And the president of the University of Pennsylvania, an upstanding Ivy League institution, lost her job because she was snickered and sandbagged on Capitol Hill, as we've discussed on this program a few weeks ago, because of her seeking to give what she considered to be a nuanced response to those who were interrogating her about these slogans. Also, with regard to the Federal Republic of Germany, they have been perhaps outdoing the United States in terms of supporting the criminal regime in Israel. Their excuse is that they're doing penance for the Holocaust against the Jewish people, 1930s to 1945. But it's rather curious that in doing penance for that ethno-nationalist regime in Berlin some 70, 80 odd years ago, they are in fact supporting an ethno-nationalist regime in historic Palestine. In Britain, you see the Prime Minister in waiting, Keir Starmer of the Labour Party. He has been as enthusiastic as Berlin in supporting the war criminals. He's learned the lesson of what befell his predecessor as leader of that party, speaking of Jeremy Corbyn, who was routed and ousted from leadership of the party because of his pro-Palestinian sentiments, which were traduced and misinterpreted as being somehow anti-Jewish. However, I would warn and caution the Zionist lobby that there are already signs that they are losing altitude. Let me point you in particular to the recent maneuvers of Nelson Peltz, a pro-Zionist billionaire who had been in the news lately because of his attempt to oust the leadership of the Disney Corporation, of which he is a major stockholder. He's also on the board of Unilever, a major European conglomerate, which controls Ben and Jerry's ice cream. Ben and Jerry have been rather sharp in their critique of Israeli settler colonialism. And as a result, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, or a so-called respectable member of the Zionist lobby, headquartered in Los Angeles, your hometown, sought to reprimand and rebuke Ben and Jerry's, and in return were rebuked by Nelson Peltz, who had been a major supporter of the Simon Wiesenthal Center. On this program, more than once, I've mentioned the story of a card-carrying member of the U.S. ruling class, speaking of James A. Baker III of Houston, Texas, who was formerly Secretary of State under the first President Bush, who sought to settle this crisis in historic Palestine, and for his troubles has been branded an anti-Jewish bigot. That has not gone down well. And in fact, I don't think that the mainstream press in the United States has covered very well the fact that many U.S. conservatives are not on board with regard to the support of Israel. And they are the power behind the ruling class throne. Another aspect of that question has arisen when you saw that Tucker Carlson, the former Fox News host, who has his own popular podcast supported by right-wingers far and wide, rebuked his fellow ultra-conservative Ben Shapiro, who is pro-Zionist, because he says that Ben Shapiro is concerned more about Israel than the United States of America. If you turn into certain other broadcasts, particularly on YouTube, of other former Fox News hosts like Judge Andrew Napolitano, for example, you'll find a similar trend. So this is something to keep an eye on going forward. And once again, going forward, I should also mention the fact that U.S. unions, led by the United Auto Workers Union, which, as you know, has an affiliate in Canada, the Postal Workers Union, they've come out in favor of a ceasefire, as have many, I should say, a number of members of the Congressional Black Caucus, including Jamal Bowman of Bronx Westchester, Summer Lee of Western Pennsylvania, Andre Carson, a Muslim of Indiana, Cori Bush of St. Louis, my hometown. And ultimately, on the ideological level, I think that the ultimate importance of this conflict on this side of the Atlantic will be to reiterate the fact that many on the left have begun to see the United States itself as a settler colonial regime. And if you do that, you have to look anew at what's referred to as the Native American question. You have to look anew at 1776 and the revolt against British rule. You have to really reformat your entire vision of the United States of America, and that's a good thing.
You're listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96. I want to turn it over to Melinda, but first I wanted to ask you. I want to ask you this question: don't you think that African Americans, obscure African Americans, for example, there was a guy by the name of Robert L. Brock who had a group called the Self-Determination Committee in Los Angeles, and I went to court with him, and we charged the United States with being he called for reparations. I basically joined. I have to give him credit. Don't you think that history has really ignored that element by, especially, as you would say, our friends on the left did not want to give those people like that any credit, because they, when they talked about the Negro question, the whole colonial question was nowhere in that equation. Am I correct in saying that?
Well, I think that's a fair assertion. I should also say, and quiet as is kept, as we used to say back in the day, many of our folks, our friends on the left, are really ambivalent about reparations. Now, I'm not necessarily sure why. I've tried to reframe reparations to make it more palatable to their exquisite taste by portraying it actually the way it is, as an aspect of a larger question of wage shorting. As you know, in the United States, it's notorious that particularly immigrant workers, they will agree to do a job at let's say $20 an hour, but at the end of the day, they're paid $5 an hour. And that is a notorious aspect of the political economy of capitalism today. And my argument is that enslaved Africans were the most egregious victims of wage shorting because we got paid nothing, basically. And so therefore compensation is due. if you're going to be consistent. I'm not sure if that particular approach, again, formatted for their exquisite tastes, have gained traction, but let us hope so.
Melinda, I defer to you.
Yeah, I think going to Venezuela and Guyana. What's your comment on the situation?
I'm not sure if we reported on this last time, but there was a meeting at St. Vincent called together by the regime there. And as I understand it, the readout is that both sides have agreed not to use armed force to settle this dispute. However, in the meantime, a British flotilla is steaming towards Georgetown, Guyana, which has incensed the folks in Caracas, Venezuela, which has sent some of its forces to the border with Guyana. So let's hope that the St. Vincent Pact holds. And for those who may not be aware of the backstory, Venezuela's argument is that an 1899 agreement between the Caracas regime of that era and the British Empire then ruling in what was called British Guyana, that it was not necessarily a legitimate accord, and they're claiming a significant percentage of what is now Guyanese territory. Of course, Guyana is receiving the support of U.S. government because it has a deal with Exxon, the U.S. Oil giant based in Texas, actually based in my neck of the woods. So it's a very complicated situation that we must keep a close and steady eye
on. You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. Could we talk about the African summit between President Xi and Mr. Biden, President Biden?
Well, this took place in San Francisco. It took place in the midst of a deteriorating bilateral relationship between the number one and number two economies. It's no secret that the United States is trapped in a contradiction. The contradiction being, on the one hand, it borrows to the tune of almost $1 trillion from the People's Bank in Beijing, although note that steadily the People's Bank has been dumping U.S. Treasury bills, U.S. paper, because it recognizes that that may not be a good deal, because as we speak, the United States is considering basically stealing billions of dollars from Russia, along with its EU piratical comrades, because they say that they want to use that money to rebuild Ukraine. And so this, if it's executed, could be a shot across the bow at Beijing. And so therefore, it's been drawing down its holdings of US paper. At the same time that the United States is dependent upon the People's Bank in Beijing, they would like to overthrow the Communist Party. Now, your audience, I'm sure, is aware that this contradiction stems from what happened about a half century ago, when the US authorities and the then Chinese leadership under Mao Zedong executed an entente on an anti-Soviet basis. I argue in my forthcoming book, Armed Struggle, ? Which you so kindly mentioned, that this had ramifications on this side of the Pacific, because it led the Black Panther Party to turn against the US Communist Party, which was pro-Moscow. And it also led to a fissure with Havana, which, if there was ever going to be an armed struggle in the United States, you would need Cuba as a rear base. So it basically wrecked that relationship as well. And at the same time, it led to massive foreign direct investment by US corporations in China, leading, I'm afraid to say, to a loss of many factory jobs on this side of the Pacific, helping to turn, say, Gary, Indiana, and towns like that into ghost towns to a certain degree. And as we've mentioned before, Leonard Woodcock, a former leader of the United Auto Workers, became a U.S. ambassador to China during the 1970s, helping to shepherd these factories in moving across the Pacific to China. So what we have to look for in 2024 is, number one, the Taiwanese election, Taiwan being the rebel province off the southern coast of China, which China claims as its own. That election will take place in about 2 weeks. Taiwan is important politically and economically because many of the chips that go into computers and smartphones are made in Taiwan by Taiwan Semiconductor, that particular corporation. And as well, we have to keep an eye on BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And by the way, as we mentioned last week, Argentina, which is really going through a crisis right now, has shot itself in the foot by saying it will not accept the invitation to join BRICS, believe it or not. Keep an eye on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a counterpoint to NATO. Keep an eye on the US presidential election of 2024, because if Mr. Trump prevails, which you cannot rule out, he will probably cut a deal with Russia so that his regime can focus like a laser beam on China. Part of the problem with the Democrats, as we've said more than once, is that because Black Americans, at least their elected representatives in Congress, and the major mass organization being the NAACP are missing in action on foreign policy, this gives the right wing in the Democratic Party carte blanche with regard to getting involved in these quagmires, be it Palestine or Ukraine or next up Taiwan, China. US ruling class has to be aware of the fact that France and Germany are not necessarily on board with regard to this new Cold War against China. Japan has 1 foot in and 1 foot out. Ditto for South Korea. The Philippines Islands, a former US colony, has decided to be the US pit bull against China and vis-a-vis Taiwan as well, which I don't think will work out very well. North Korea is very upset with the United States right now. And as a matter of fact, in the last 24 to 48 hours, is threatened that a war, their term, not mine, may erupt between North Korea and the United States if the United States does not stop its provocations against the regime. India is the wild card because it's now the most populous nation on planet Earth as part of the BRICS, but it has longstanding grievances against China. The North Atlantic countries would like to turn India frontally against China. I'm not so sure even if Kool Modi, the prime minister, will go for that, but we shall see. But in any case, Apple, which has been building many of its smartphones in China, turning into a multi-trillion-dollar corporation, the most valuable corporation right now in the United States of America, has now begun to move many of its production facilities to India. So keep an eye on that too going forward.
You might as well plug your book. You wrote a book on India. Could you talk about that before we close out?
Yeah, I did a book some years ago, End of Empires, African Americans in India, tracing that relationship up to Indian independence in 1947, and then with an epilogue dealing with Dr. King's relationship to Gandhi, for example, and that philosophy of passive nonviolent resistance. Since you've mentioned books, and I've already talked about the forthcoming book, Armed Struggle, my next book out of the chute will probably be in 2025, Slavery's Capital of Human Bondage in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., the so-called Citadel of Liberty, also, believe it or not, was a major slave trading enterprise, figuratively, if not literally, at the foot of Capitol Hill. And when I've announced this book, I've heard from folks whose roots stretch back to enslavement in Virginia and Maryland, and certainly I would like to hear from you, and particularly you in Trinidad, because as I've talked in a previous book, when the British invaded Washington in 1814, enslaved Africans joined in burning down the White House and then fled on British ships to Trinidad and Tobago. So I know that there are folks in your audience who may be descendant of those Trinis. I'd like to hear from you as well. I'm also doing a book on what I call Greater Egypt and Greater Ethiopia. By Greater Egypt, I'm not only referring to Egypt heading west through Libya and Tunisia and Algeria and Morocco, but also heading east as far as Iran in the context of the African slave trade, which does not end in Iran, believe it or not, till 1928, 1929. And it's carried on in Egypt after it's abolished in the United States. In fact, one of my key chapters deals with the slave owners after they're defeated in the United States. They scurry to Egypt, where they try to assist the Egyptian regime in overthrowing the Ethiopian regime, interestingly enough. So keep an eye out for that book for the next few years. And then I'm doing a book on Southeast Asia and U.S. imperialism before and after the U.S. Takeover of the Philippines, circa 1898. And just two factoids in that regard, because I know we're running out of time. One is that two of the characters in this book were the original Siamese twins. I mean, they're Thai who were connected to one another, or, quote, discovered, unquote, by a missionary in the 1830s. They come to the United States and become a sort of carnival act, and then become prominent slave owners, believe it or not, in North Carolina, and married to Euro-American women now, and father children. The descendants are with us to this very day. How they did that, well, you have to read the book. And also, I'm going to deal in that book with what is now Brunei, which is a major oil-producing monarchy to this very day. But from about the 1840s up until about 400 years, it was run by British guys, the Brooke family. They came there and just took over and ran it as a private enterprise, not unlike what King Leopold did with regard to the Congo from about the 1880s up until independence in 1960. And so that's going to be part of the story as well. And then finally, January 1 marks the triumph of the Haitian Revolution, 1804, the triumph of the Cuban Revolution, 1959. We all owe a debt of gratitude to both revolutions. And so it's appropriate to take off our caps and doff our hats and give a hearty salute to the Haitian Revolution and the Cuban Revolution.
And I would just like to end by saying about the Siamese twins. I would like to leave everyone with a quote by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. As Lenin once said, "Only Allah knows how that happened."
I see.
He did. That is a direct quote. You can, yeah. He said it in. Just you Google it. And
did he say that in general or about the Siamese twins fathering children?
No, I don't think he. I don't even know about the Siamese twin situation in Lenin, but he said that in a Congress, he was talking to a group of Muslims. I think it was Bun or something. The Bun 19. All you got to do is Google it. But yeah, he made a statement. He was talking to a predominantly Muslim audience, and someone asked him a question, and it was as a materialist, I guess you say you might not know the answer right now, but eventually, being a materialist, humanity will figure it out at some point in time. It was in that context.
I see.
Yeah, but I used to always get in trouble on on CKLN, I would always quote that, and the phones would light up from a lot of the white Marxists would call in. This guy he's saying that Lenin was a Muslim and blah blah, which I didn't say. Is there anything else you'd like to add, my friend?
Only that I'll see comrades and friends on February 3rd, 2024, Lamert Park, 1 to 3. Be there or be square. Go to kpfk.org or to the Gerald Horne Facebook page for further details.
Thank you, sir.
Good luck.
And I'd like to thank Lisa Watson for technical brilliance as usual, and anything you'd like to say, Melinda Francis.
Yeah, we'll see everybody in the whirlwind.